We're live.
Ok. Olá, pessoal. Sejam bem-vindos ao SiMN 2021. Não sei se todos estão sabendo, mas nesses últimos 5 minutos tivemos um problema de servidor com o Facebook, com o WhatsApp, com o StreamYard, enfim. Temos uma pequena mudança de sala no YouTube. Espero que todo mundo tenha recebido o novo link, né? A equipe do SiMN 2021 está encaminhando esse novo link para todos, né? Mas, de qualquer forma, estamos aqui iniciando a 5ª edição do Simpósio Internacional de Música Nova. É um evento organizado por 2 grupos de pesquisa, da Unespar e da UFPR, né? É a 5ª edição, o evento existe desde 2012, né? Um evento em Curitiba dedicado à música experimental e música contemporânea. E uma das características desse evento é que nós buscamos sempre oportunizar, fomentar a música nova, a música sendo criada hoje, né? Bom, vocês vão ver na programação do evento que nós temos vários concertos, nós temos várias comunicações orais, apresentação de paper e algumas palestras recitais, né? O evento começa hoje, vai até quinta-feira, dia 7, né, de outubro, agora, nessa semana, durante as tardes e as noites, né? E então, se vocês acionarem o nosso site sim.com.br, vocês vão ter acesso a toda a programação, né, e a todos os links, tá? Primeiramente, agradecer a nossas instituições, né, a Unespar e a UFPR, pelo apoio, né, por receber os nossos grupos de pesquisa. Queria também agradecer os membros da equipe, né, que é o professor Clayton e o Antônio, né? Então a equipe, a comissão organizadora, né? E queria também agradecer os apoiadores, né, as instituições de fora que apoiam o evento, né? Temos o PPG-MUS, né, da Unespar e da UFPR, nós temos a Orquestra Filarmônica da UFPR como apoiadora, temos o Panorama da Unesp com o professor Flô Menezes como apoiador dessa edição do evento. Temos o palco dos 5 Sentidos, né, que nesse momento de pandemia nos cedeu o seu palco para que pudéssemos realizar as gravações, os concertos. Agradecer também ao SIM, que é o Círculo de Invenção Musical, é um coletivo de compositores aqui de Curitiba. E por último, agradecer ao Laboratório de Música, Sonologia e Áudio, LaMusa, né, por gravar esses concertos que a gente vai ver durante a semana, e a revista Vortex como parceira de publicação. Bom, eu vou mudar rapidamente para o inglês, vou fazer uma breve apresentação em inglês, e aí a gente começa a nossa palestra de abertura. Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Felipe. Welcome to the 5th edition of the SiMN, the International Symposium of Música Nova. And this is a symposium that exists since 2012. It's biannual symposium. And we're happy to have this 5th edition happening because it was supposed to be presented in 2020, but because of the pandemic, we were unable to prepare our festival. But we still decided to make our event in a virtual online version. So I would like to welcome you and to visit our website, sim.com.br. Over there, you'll have access to all the schedule, all the links. So you'll notice that the time zone is in Brazil, Brasilia, the city, right? So be careful with that. But with the links, I think with all the YouTube links, it will match your time zone, right? So before we start, I would like to thank our team, which is Professor Dr. Clayton Mamedes and Antonio Spoladori, which they were crucial to the whole organization of this edition. I would like also to thank the artistic and scientific committee and all the institutions involved in this fifth edition, both universities, the State University of Paraná and the Federal University of Paraná, home of our research groups. I would like also to thank the Palco dos Cinco Sentidos, which kindly helped us with the recordings, with a space, with a venue for all the recordings of the concerts. I would like to thank the Philharmonic Orchestra from UFPR, La Musa, the Laboratory of Music, Sonology, and Audio. I would also like to thank Professor Flo Menezes and Panorama Studio, the Círculo de Invenção Musical, a young collective of composers from the city of Curitiba. And last but not least, Revista Vortex, the Vortex Music Journal, which is our partner for publications, and the Graduate Studies department from both our universities, which also helped us organizing this, the fifth issue of the SiMN. So now I would like to welcome Professor Brandon LaBelle for this opening lecture, this our keynote speaker. And I would also like to welcome Professor Clayton Mamedes to present Professor LaBelle.
Good afternoon. Let me introduce our keynote speaker of today. Brandon LaBelle is an artist, writer, and theorist working with sound culture, voice, and questions of agents. He develops and presents artistic projects and performances within a range of international contexts, often working collaboratively and in public. This leads to interventions and performative installations, poetic theater, storytelling, and research actions aimed at forms of experimental community making. From gestures of intimacy and listening to critical festivity and open movement work, his practice aligns itself with the politics and poetics of radical civility. Professor LaBelle is author of several books, all of them bringing innovative discussions to the fields of music and sound art, such as acoustic justice, the other citizen, sonic agency, lexicon of the mouth, acoustic territories, and background noise. Since 2011, he works as a professor at the Art Academy of the Department of Contemporary Art at the University of Bergen, Norway. Today, Professor LaBelle will present us the lecture, Listening Otherwise, Sound and Acoustic Care. Professor LaBelle, we are honored that you joined this year's edition of SiMN as our keynote speaker. Thank you very much. I now invite you to take the floor, please.
Yes, thank you so much. It's really such an honor and such a pleasure to come and kick off this year's symposium. So thank you really much for the invitation. So as you were already saying a little bit in my biography, I have been working both as an artist and also as an academic, researching and working with sound as an artistic material and also as a kind of framework to get involved in different kinds of investigations. So sound for me is a very dynamic, very generative framework and issue that allows for many different kinds of activities, as well as, I would say, primarily forms of collaboration. So this is something very important to me, very essential in my practice. So I was thinking for today to extend a little bit from my more recent publication under the title Acoustic Justice. So I'm going to kind of map out a set of terms or concepts that I've been focusing on quite a bit recently, and also in the context of that research and that publication. So I do hope that these concepts and topics can contribute to the discussions and the activities there that you're focusing on at the symposium. So I certainly look forward to some conversation afterwards if there's questions and so forth. I'm very open and happy to be in dialogue. So the concepts or terms that I'm going to focus on today really very much focus in and around the topic of acoustics. So I'm going to kind of work with acoustics, but maybe in a somewhat unconventional way, which I hope can become more clear as we move along. So from the beginning, I can say that I'm working with acoustics, understanding it as what positions sound, and by extension, our listening subjectivity. So acoustics is therefore to be understood as a material practice, maybe a spatial, architectural, material practice, as well as, importantly, a social and political question. Acoustics may be said to allow us to get into the relationalities that are generated through experiences of sound and listening. For instance, if we understand listening as what brings me out of myself, puts me into relation, in a sense, makes of myself a dimension, even a milieu. So I can say from the beginning, if listening is about giving attention, if it's about a kind of economy of attention, then acoustics is what we do to facilitate or modulate that attention, to work at that economy within a given situation. So I'm certainly looking at acoustics as a kind of practice, and I'll elaborate that as we go along. I can also say that maybe on a more artistic or practice-based level then, a focus on acoustics also allows us to shift from concentrating on the idea of producing a sound, producing a sonic object, and instead maybe allows us to address the conditions by which people come together and speak and listen to each other. So understanding acoustics as a framework which is about sound, but also about the situations that allow sounds to occur, to gain traction, to also find its way through different environments. So the question then might be, what gestures, what kinds of constructions or arrangements can be made to enable the movement of sound, especially when it comes to extending the arena of what or who is heard. In other words, in what way do we care for acoustics? And in doing so, care for the circulation of a diversity of views and voices. So these are some preliminary comments, which I hope already suggest a certain kind of territory and a certain kind of understanding of acoustics. Maybe it also helps to come back a little bit and also think about acoustics on a very general, fundamental level if we go back and think acoustics as a design practice. As acoustics is, of course, a design, spatial, architectural practice that is very much involved in shaping our sound environments. If we can think of acoustics as what shapes sound environments. So it is, of course, very involved in developing particular strategies within architecture, within urban planning contexts, thinking about how sound is present within our environments, within our urban situations, for example, our domestic spaces, in what way sound participates in those spaces, in those environments, and how do we sort of engage in that in a sort of design strategy. So acoustics is certainly a question about space, about environments, and often sets out by responding to certain conditions, certain sonic phenomena. So if we can think that acoustics often intervenes with material or technical adjustments, often related to noise, related to vibration or echo. So we can say that in shaping environments, in kind of understanding the relationship between sound and space on a very material, physical level, acoustics, we could say, also works at somehow producing or making a particular sonic image or sonic signature, what we might even think of as a room tonality, a room tonality. So what I want to suggest in a way is that acoustics is implicated in a very dramatic way in enabling the movement of particular sounds, allowing certain sounds to be heard more than others. In this way, we can start to ask or start to raise a certain kind of critical perspective, which is to say, in what way does acoustics participate in reinforcing certain acoustic norms or certain listening habits? So for instance, we might ask, what counts as good sound or deviant or dirty sound? If we think of this as a kind of acoustic norm around which we sort of understand what constitutes a good sound, what constitutes a bad sound within our environments. So clearly we might start to think that acoustics is involved in establishing particular acoustic norms, particular listening habits, that we can say also entrenches itself or impacts on our relationships then. So following this, maybe we can start to understand how I'm also a little bit interested in bringing not only a critical perspective, maybe even a creative perspective onto acoustics, but also to position it, to ask, or to understand it also as participating in a kind of political context. And here I draw upon, for instance, the work of Jacques Rancière, his political theories, and his fundamental idea of the distribution of the sensible that he argues for, understanding the political as just that, as a process that impacts on what becomes apparent, for instance, within the public sphere. So the distribution of the sensible really becomes about what do we encounter, what do we see, what do we hear in our public environments. So then what are the kind of particular systems or structures that make those things possible? Here, the political becomes really a question of certain kinds of tensions, certain kinds of arguments, certain kinds of negotiations around that distribution of the sensible. So we can see quite clearly, for instance, how particular social movements, particular forms of minor politics argue for having a space of appearance, for intervening on that distribution of the sensible in order to have a say, in order to have a presence. So what I want to do is then think about acoustics as being very much participating in that distribution. So we could say to think the acoustics as the distribution of the heard, or the distribution of what we hear. So thinking about acoustics as being one of those things that participates in those systems, in those ideological systems or values or even decisions that lend to what we hear in our public environments. So the distribution of the herd, then, if we kind of mobilize that, if we kind of use that as a vocabulary for understanding acoustics, I think we start to raise certain questions or start to enable certain critical and also creative perspectives. So here we could say that what I'm really arguing for is understanding acoustics as something that aligns and impacts onto questions of sociability, the shaping of the distribution of the herd within particular environments, then in a way impacts on how we encounter each other, how we hear each other, what voices or views circulate within our environments, and in which I can participate as a voice. So this is also very much tied to material work. Again, going back to acoustics as bringing forward a certain material knowledge, a certain knowledge about sound and space, the construction of the built environment. And in a way, then the question is, well, again, what are the acoustic norms that impact that shaping, that material work? So for instance, as one example, a very dramatic example in which acoustics is very active is, of course, within concert hall design. That's the design of concert halls, which I guess you are probably often engaging with as musicians, as composers. So here, I'm very curious if we think of the concert hall as not only a particular architecture, but as a set of acoustic decisions that kind of are embedded in that space. And there's maybe two ways we might think that. One would be through the notion of fidelity, the idea of fidelity, which is often quite present within concert hall design. So fidelity being staying true to particular sounds. So for instance, within a concert hall, I may think, well, in that space as an audience member, I need to be able to hear, particular instruments on the stage in a way that doesn't distort that sound by the time it reaches me wherever I am in the concert hall. So staying true to certain sounds allows us to appreciate the musical moment, yes, to appreciate the dynamic of a composition in a sense as an audience member, where I can really, in a way, immerse myself as well as somehow retain a sense of clarity. So fidelity and concert hall design is often about creating that sense of immersion, that as an audience, I want to feel the sound, I want to feel the music as an experience, as an aesthetic experience, while at the same time retaining a sense of clarity, yes, between the instrumentation, between the dynamics of sound, all the kind of frequency range needs to somehow reach me in a clear manner. So how do we immerse and remain clear at the same time? Yeah, this is a challenge within concert hall design. Within at least a kind of Western European context, there has emerged a general understanding of a standard of reverberation time around 2 seconds. So in order to, again, be immersive and clear, a 2-second reverberation time has sort of become a general standard. So I'm very much interested then to think, well, how do those 2 seconds of reverberation impact and shape our listening habits, our listening experiences? So if I'm sort of situated in an architectural environment, if I'm situated in a musical culture that is defined by that standard to a certain degree, how does that then shape what I understand music to be? You know, how does that shape or impact my sense of this being a good composition or this being a good experience? And this maybe extends also to the topic of reflection. Reflection is also very key within acoustic design. Reflection being the giving traction to certain sounds. Yes, almost a sense of supporting the movement of a sound through an environment, through a sense of reflection, absorption and reflection. Yes. Utilizing those two things in a design strategy, again, to produce a certain musical experience. So some questions might be really, if we think about fidelity, one question would be, well, fidelity to what? What are we staying true to? What are we deciding is an important sound within this environment that one has to concentrate on and, again, give a certain kind of support to? And again, reflection might be, well, reflection to what end or for whom? Yes, what are we giving reflection to? What are we supporting within the array of sounds around us? What is this, in a sense, the sound of value? So, of course, I'm kind of playing with these terms, playing a little bit with acoustic design and questions of fidelity and reflection, kind of repositioning them a little bit, relocating them around other questions, which I hope can kind of start to maybe give an indication or give a sense about how I'm approaching acoustics, and maybe in a way what acoustics also allows us to do in terms of our critical thinking, in terms of our engagement with sound and listening as being very impactful onto our relationships, onto a sense of public culture and civic space. If we think of concert halls as fundamentally civic spaces. So following these perspectives, I think we can start to say that acoustics can be seen to contribute to establishing acoustic communities. We might even think, if we think of musical communities that gather around certain spaces of presentation, certain concert spaces, the communities that sort of gather there and that sort of find a certain kind of identity or commonality around musical experiences. Again, how does acoustics shape a sense of community in terms of, again, impacting on our listening habits, our listening subjectivity? And here I can make a reference to the work of Roshana Keshti, who talks about what she calls regimes of orality, regimes of orality. And I think this can be quite interesting to think again about the systems, about the acoustic norms that in a way may start to somehow operate as a regime of orality. So this also raises the question, how do we hear that which extends beyond a certain acoustic norm? How do I hear beyond a certain acoustic norm? How do I hear beyond a certain distribution of the heard? So this is a question I'm very interested in. And here we can say that acoustics really impacts not only in terms of what we hear, but then how we come to access our physical, social, or even institutional environments. Navigating the situations and systems that work to give order to who may be heard and where. And also then to the capacity for certain meanings to circulate. Not only the voices or the particular views, but the meanings that really become important to a community. So here I'm also curious and interested to draw upon the work of Judith Butler and her notion of performativity that I'm sure many of you also maybe think about in your own practices. This question of performativity that Butler really argues for in so many interesting ways. So performativity is very much about how we also negotiate as subjects larger power relationships, whether that's through language and the ways in which language shapes me as a subject. This is how sort of Butler argues for performativity. So for instance, as a subject, I'm in a way called into my subjectivity through language. Language comes to me and calls me into the social order. At the same time, I also use language as a subject. I then take up my position within the social order and I find my voice, within that language. So performativity is always a dynamic relationality, a dynamic sense of being situated within an exteriority, within a social order, and developing certain strategies, maybe certain practices, certain capacities through which I find myself within that order. And here I think I want to kind of, move then to an idea of acoustic performativity. So the question is then, as a listening subject, how do I negotiate those systems, that social order around me by means of sound, by means of listening, by means of all the different kinds of practices, musical practices, auditory practices, sonic practices, listening practices that really kind of help me as a subject, help me find my way within the social order, help me in the finding relationships, finding commonalities with others. So acoustic performativity then can, I think, help us in this discussion about how we modulate or negotiate the distribution of the herd. So again, what kind of practices do I bring to that distribution in order to negotiate, again, finding my place within that distribution, finding my voice within that arena, that acoustic arena. So this acoustic performativity then leads to a sense of how we work across, how we work against certain acoustic norms, shifting understandings, or also the dynamics of fidelity and reflection. Again, how do I also redirect the distribution of the herd, redirect certain acoustic normativities to allow us to say, well, this sound is important. This sound over that sound. This sound also needs reflection. It needs support. So to also dilate or distort or reinvent a given sonic image, or to what we could even think of retune or detune a certain room tonality. How do we recompose the social order acoustically? So then we can maybe follow this then, shifting from understanding acoustics as a professional practice, as a sort of as a particular skill within a particular professional environment, and to think acoustics more in terms of the everyday. How are we acousticians? How am I an acoustician in my home environment here? So bringing acoustics closer to us into the everyday. What kinds of acoustic gestures do we find? Acoustic practices do we make to modulate the distribution of the herd, to develop certain kinds of performative strategies? So I'm just going to kind of lay out a few possibilities we can maybe explore. I think from the beginning, we can really appreciate the question of silence and noise as being very central to acoustic practices. So silence and noise are certainly very dynamic, very dramatic areas of sound, or frameworks by which we experience sound, even a kind of imaginary of sound that we carry with us. And here, quite clearly, we can see how we also start to develop a certain kind of understanding of intervening on that kind of sense of silence and noise. So for instance, simply turning up or turning down our sound system at home, for instance, or reaching to our computer, turning up the volume, turning down the volume. And here, this simple gesture, I think, of reaching for volume, reaching into the issue of volume and modulating it, changing volume, is already an acoustic gesture, is already a gesture that intervenes on the distribution of the herd. So we can see we can think about all the different environments we inhabit through daily life, and all the different moments in which we change volume on various devices, for instance, or we're also disturbed by volume. We also move away from a noise, maybe in a public environment. We close our ears, or we also go towards certain sounds. We gravitate towards certain things that we hear. We want sort of more of it. You know? So here, these simple gestures of intervening on volume, I think, already begins to suggest an idea of everyday practices of acoustic modulation. If we think, of course, volume as both a sound and also a question of space, here we dramatically sense in which we are contributing to not only what we hear, but also a certain kind of spatial volume. So we can kind of extend this through different frameworks. So for instance, we can think very much about rhythm. The question of rhythm is also a very interesting framework to consider acoustic practices as I'm presenting it. And here we can think about rhythm as what we could say as the establishment of a pattern. Rhythm is, of course, many things, but we could say rhythm establishes a pattern. It is, of course, about repetition, the modulation of repetition, but it's also about synchronization and desynchronization within that pattern. So for instance, we can think of all the different rhythms that surround us. For instance, on the street, at home, the rhythms that also define our life. You know, if we wake up at a certain time, if we go to our favorite cafe around the same time, you know, all the repetitions, all the patterns that shape our life and that we also develop and cultivate for ourselves. Rhythm helps us, it becomes a structure that allows us to synchronize our sense of place. We kind of synchronize with things around us, and at the same time we also desynchronize. Maybe we also break away from certain patterns. We redirect certain rhythmic recurrences, constantly shaping and reshaping that sense of being situated within a larger structure. So I think rhythm here becomes a very interesting way of considering acoustic practices. Again, that also maybe helps us realize that it's not always about sound particularly. Acoustics also can be about a sense of orientation, a sense of being a body oriented within a larger situation or system. And again, what do we do, performatively speaking, to participate in that larger order, participate within that larger orientation? So another way to maybe think about that is also through the idea of vibration. Vibration, I think, can become also a very interesting arena to think about acoustic practices. And here I want to just suggest that we understand vibration as tonality of place. If we think that places have a certain tonality to them, a certain kind of atmosphere, a certain kind of affective presence, that I feel a place, I sense a place. And we know very well the idea of kind of having a good vibe. I don't know if this translates into, but a play, like you enter into a club and you think, oh, this has a good vibe here. I like this vibe, or this is a bad vibe, you know. So we feel places through vibration. And then in a way, we can say we also construct vibrations. We construct our home environments, for instance, so we feel at home. Or maybe we arrange our desk in a certain way to feel like this is working, like I'm feeling connected, you know, to where I am. Vibration is very much about connecting, feeling my body as sort of part of a larger situation, part of others. Vibration is very much about a kind of ecology of togetherness, an ecology of feeling connected. So we can see quite clearly that vibration can become a scene of practice, a scene of arranging things. And I think here we can appreciate acoustics as very much establishing a kind of atmosphere, arranging things to produce a certain atmosphere that can be very much about welcoming others, can be a gesture of hospitality, that I create a vibe so my friends feel like they want to come over, they want to be near me. Or we can also say that we intervene in other situations. We also change the tonality of places, or we work at establishing certain tonalities to orient us around a sense of togetherness. And then finally, maybe we can think about echo. I think echo can be also another way in to acoustic practices. And here, maybe we can think again, going back to the question of language, about how we acquire language. And we acquire language very much through echo. Someone tells us what to say. I learn language because I follow others. I know how something sounds because someone has told me and said it to me. So I repeat the words. This is how I learn to speak. So we echo each other, and we learn by echoing each other. We bring words into us and we play them back. So this is very much Butler and her idea of performativity, very much in a sense. So this can be very much about mimicry, about a mimesis, a sense of again, a sense of responding to others, mirroring each other. And it can also be very much about differentiation, about distinguishing myself against others or in relationship to others. So echoing becomes very much a kind of creative and critical practice. What do we echo? What do we take into ourselves? What contributes to developing me as a subject? And again, what do I do with that in terms of repeating it or bringing it back into my environments? So maybe it's also a form of citation. You know, what do we cite? What are the ones of the others that I align myself with, that I cite the words as my own? So here echo can, I think, become also a very interesting framework to think about practices that intervene on what we hear and how we hear them. Again, what kinds of sounds are reflected back into our environments, and contribute to establishing certain communities. So I hope this starts to map out what I'm talking about in terms of acoustics as as a practice, as an everyday practice that we take into our own sense of place and sense of environments, to in a way also support our capacities to hear and to be heard, to intervene in the economy of attention, but also to attune or retune our environments or institutions so we can maybe better engage in experiences or processes of mutuality as well as disagreement. So acoustics can be very much about establishing, arranging, creating environments, creating situations and the conditions for certain kinds of social and political enactments. So here we could think, how does acoustics participate, for instance, in scenes of democracy? If we start thinking broader, maybe we start thinking more macro political, not only about myself as a subject, the communities I participate in, but also our institutional environments, our environments of government, even of education. I think the spaces of education, our educational institutions, how might we engage in them as acoustic environments that really very much impact on our education and our becoming informed and educated citizens? What kinds of acoustic decisions or norms define those environments and therefore then impact on how I become an educated citizen, for instance? So what kind of decisions, what kind of economies define the spaces we pass through or live in? What acoustic arrangements are needed, for instance, to nurture intimacy, to nurture friendship, as well as a certain kind of sense of recognition, being recognized by each other. So here, maybe we start to arrive at this question of care that I wanted to also mention, an idea of acoustic care. If acoustics is also very much about what we hear, but also how we become oriented within a larger environment, how do we care for that orientation? How do we care for that larger relational ecology? How do we care for being able to hear each other, to find partnerships and companionships? Of course, to also cultivate ways of being together. So acoustic care might be said to give room for a diversity of orientations, social orientations, bodily orientations, sexual orientations. How do we care for our environments, our acoustic situations, to support a diversity of orientations? This might also, I think, start to help us be more sensitive, of course, not only to sound and the importance of listening, but also understanding how those things are very much about the relationships that we participate in, that we contribute to. So I wanted to, if I still have some time, I wanted to just share my screen and maybe just talk through a project I was involved with. Maybe I started to think it also can maybe help to think a bit more concretely, for instance, in which acoustics can be practiced, can be negotiated, can be brought in to a material sense, and also a kind of creative sense. So I just wanted to refer to some activities that I was part of in Curitiba in 2017. Maybe some of you recall the Ocena de Autonomia in 2017, which was canceled at the last minute. At that time, I was invited to come to the city and teach at the Ocena. So I was preparing to be there, preparing to visit when the cancellation happened. And I was at that time very much in dialogue with my friend and collaborator, Octavio Camargo. And we decided together that I should come anyways. We weren't gonna cancel our plans. So the question really was, how do we continue? In a way, maybe how do we use this opportunity to also reorient our understandings of what a Officina de Musica could be about? What does it mean to undertake a kind of workshop in musical practices? So in collaboration with Octavio, Charisse Gomez, and many others, we decided to hold an officina at the house of Octavio. And we came up with this notion of Ocena de Autonomia. So thinking very much about autonomous practices, the Autonomia movement, which is very much maybe about self-organizing, about certain anarchic principles of direct democracy, ideas about working together in a cooperative manner. So we developed this meeting, really. We extended an invitation to local musicians, composers, actors. Everyone was welcome to join us for a series of discussions together. And in a way, what we really started to do was to think about music, think about sound and listening, not only in the context of, for instance, the concert or even the closed workshop, but in terms of ideas about public life, public culture, ideas about civic space, and in a way, somehow thinking, well, what does this cancellation mean, in terms of a certain governmental decision that was really, in a way, an attack on culture. So through a really kind of open and very generous situation, as you see here, we were able to, I think, really get into some wonderful discussions and in a way organize ourselves as a community, as an officina. And I think one of the key things that really came up was thinking about listening as a form of activism. How can we take our knowledge as composers, for instance, our knowledge as musicians, as cultural makers, and apply them to the public sphere, apply them to questions of the city, to the arena of politics and government, really to think music in a very broad sense as a practice that really brings a lot of understanding onto what it means to be together, what it means to share space, what it means to listen to each other. Yeah, I think, of course, as musicians, as composers, we are expert listeners. So maybe, in fact, we should be very present within the arena of government, contributing our knowledge, contributing our sensitivities to debates and discussions. So I was very happy and very excited by what we were doing here and the questions that were coming forward. I think for me, it starts to speak back, or at least speak towards these issues that I'm now talking about with acoustics. At this time, I wasn't thinking about that, but I think these experiences, taught me a lot, and I was able to draw from them to think about acoustics in this sense. And I can say that the officina, we sort of ended our experience together by taking the idea of listening activism and bringing it into the city, bringing it to particular civic environments. So we really decided as a group to go to specific sites in the city, to enter them, and to undertake a collective listening position. Yeah. So we went to the governor's house. We went inside. We were able to get inside, and we spent 10 to 15 minutes listening together. And in a way, we were very curious to say, well, how can listening impact our environments? Not only to think that it's something we receive, that it's a position of being receptive, but also like a force, an act that we make and that brings a certain energy onto our environments. So listening as a form of activism, we tried to kind of enact, or at least to explore. We went to the office of the mayor, again, entered as a collective, spent time there, listening, and in a way, kind of gathering our individual listening. There was a kind of wonderful sense of being together in this kind of silent manner, and sort of in a way feeling or wondering a little bit what our listening could do. Bringing it out to a public space in the city. And what was really kind of wonderful was like, it's not so often that you see a group of people standing together, but quiet and clearly concentrating on something. And I think people around us started to also come closer and almost listen, kind of wondering what we were hearing. So we kind of, I think listening became a bit contagious. And then finally, we ended up here. I believe this is the Capella Santa Maria, a concert venue that was going to be used as part of the Officina. So we gathered here and we listened as our kind of final site. So here, I think I just point at this again to think how acoustic practices, how this question of acoustics that I'm raising, maybe how we can give a kind of example or give an indication or point at the ways in which that could be understood in a very material and a very kind of engaged sense in terms of cultivating and really enabling ideas about what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be part of certain communities, and what acoustics and listening can really bring to those communities. I'm just gonna stop sharing now. Okay. So, well, that concludes my presentation. So thank you very much, and I'm very much open to questions or any comments.
Thank you very much, Brandon. Well, participants who would like to place questions, you can use the chat on YouTube, and we can read. If you're not comfortable with writing in English, you can write in Portuguese, and we can translate. So feel free to place questions. And since we have some small delay of some 20 seconds between the YouTube and the real life of our conversation, I would like to thank you for your lecture, Brandon. Your talk is extremely pertinent, especially in the political context that we are currently living in Brazil. I believe that you provided us with a lot of great reference to work with in order to find a way to act through our sound practices. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Brandon. And I think I will start with a question so then people can warm up. Is that okay? You talk about care, right? And just to clarify, I understand the translation is actually to care about people, right? It's in this human, let's say, human sense of caring about people, right? So the idea of connecting, and that's what you mean about care, right? Am I okay? So and then you also mentioned about acoustics and reverberation, and I was thinking about high reverberation more than 2 seconds, like you said, then perhaps three. Some musical expressions happens in this quite reverberant space. So perhaps the whole Christian culture comes from, let's say, long duration reverberation, right? So perhaps from the Middle Ages until Bach, reverberation was quite high, especially the music written for the church. But then you have low reverberation places and for music situations. So, for instance, the whole idea of electroacoustic music, we can say that exists in place with low reverberation. So I'm thinking about also in acoustics, we talk about warm acoustics. You know, oh, this hall has a warm feeling, and I think it gives us the idea of belonging, right? That the idea of warm acoustics, of a dry sound, approximate us with the idea of belonging. Would you say that the opposite is also true? High reverberant places pushes us apart. How was your experience at the governor's house? I would say there's a bit of reverberation there. Is it a place of pressure, of some sort of violence?
Yeah, thanks, Felipe. No, that's wonderful. I think your examples, your perspectives, that's really nice to kind of appreciate exactly that. It's different ways in which acoustics produces certain experiences, certain qualities of experience. And I like very much this idea of warm acoustics, and how certain environments have this quality. And then, of course, also cold acoustics we can think about. And I guess maybe, this idea of high and low as well. I think your example of the church, for instance, is very strong in terms of really working with reverberation to really produce a sense of being involved with God, being involved with the heavens, this sense of lifting up, the ways in which the cathedral, acoustically speaking, has this feeling of, rising us to the sky, lifting up the voice, for instance. So to, in a way, relate to something above us, quite literally. And the ways in which reverberation, that extended reverberation, really has this feeling of being immersed or being in a house of God, being close to this transcendence, this spiritual transcendence. And I think maybe we can think about this, as you point at, with the governor's house or with other spaces of authority, for instance, that might also use acoustics in the sense of a large volume to express authority, to express that you are in a house and you are a subject, a small a small subject within those houses. So I think this also, can become, quite active as an acoustic decision to create this sense that of strength, of authority, of a higher dimension, as you say. And there may be a violence in that. There may be a sense of putting us in our place, or making sure that we remain on a certain level of feeling that there's something above us, quite literally, something on top of us and above us that we have to appeal to as subjects. So I think it's nice. I think quite clearly, it's a wonderful perspective you open up, Felipe, to think about authority and how reverberation participates in that. And then sort of the other side, we can also think I'm really did some research on, for instance, prisons and the acoustics and architecture of prisons. And we can think very much about the individual cell and how often this can also be about reducing reverberation, you know. So it's interesting how reverberation also often equates with a sense of life, you know. If we think about room tones, like for instance, going into an anechoic chamber, there's always a sense, we call this a dead space. No reverberation, it's dead. And so we can see how reverberation really gives us a feeling of life, you know, of life around us. And maybe the church, again, it's like a lot of life. It's like, and it's interesting, you know, certainly within prisons, this feeling of like cold acoustics, of low reverberation, of feeling that one is very much alone. And this can also be a violence to that. So I think, again, this is maybe a very strong, interesting framework to think through in terms of understanding acoustics in this way.
All right, thank you. I think we have more questions. I'll read the first one. So this is, I guess this is from Ricardo Tomasi. He says, Brandon, can you talk a little more about the biopolitical perspective of the acoustics that you mentioned in the beginning? How Rancière's theory supports your analysis? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, this question of the biopolitical. I mean, maybe this is maybe completely another area we might open up. So for instance, within my publication, Acoustic Justice, I finished the book with a chapter on deafness, concentrating on deafness. And I kind of worked with deafness really in a way to challenge myself, challenge my own work with sound. You know, if I'm constantly concentrating on sound and listening as important aspects, important capacities or materials that really enable and support subjectivity, support relationships, that also, in a way, as we're talking about, impacts or can be used to also challenge communities, challenge a sense of being a body in a space. And so it felt important to address deafness as clearly something that helps us rethink or helps us question certain assumptions about sound and listening. And maybe even going back to this comment we were just talking about, the ways in which reverberation equates with life, you know, equates with a feeling of life, with vitality. You know, sound is often understood as what animates things. You know, it's an animate material event that gives an indication of something being alive. You know? So I speak, I'm heard, and then, you know, I have a sense of presence. So there is very much a feeling that, you know, our sense of being a bodily being in society gains a lot through sound. So again, putting deafness onto the table, introducing it into a discussion about sound, I think also helps us, you know, recognize certain assumptions we may make. So for instance, you know, I sort of work with deafness to exactly point at the biopolitical and maybe what I also call the bioacoustic. Thinking about the bioacoustic not only in terms of, you know, language or in terms of sound signaling, you know, across different species, but also again to say, well, how is the bioacoustic also a political question in terms of how I, again, gain a sense of agency through sound, and so what happens in the framework of deafness. And I think clearly deaf communities and deaf history is marked by a lot of discriminations, a lot of prejudices, a lot of institutional challenges, precisely because there is a feeling of there being a subject, a community without sound, and therefore without agency, without the capacity to participate in the bioacoustic arena in which life is understood through sound. So quite clearly this becomes a biopolitical, I think, kind of argument or question. So I try to talk about deafness in that way, and to sort of also use deafness then to extend how we understand sound and listening. So I also work through different scholars within deaf studies, certain artistic and cultural movements within deaf communities, deaf theater, for instance, to show also how very much the deaf are also not without sound. So the deaf also listen, and they have a very strong relationship to sound. So it also becomes really helpful to learn from the deaf in terms of what sound is, or how we understand listening. Can we listen, through the hand? Can I speak, of course, through my hand? All these things that the deaf do show us. So it helps us then to think the biopolitical and to think the bioacoustic differently, or at least to intervene on what we assume that to be. So this is a perspective. It probably requires a lot more conversation, but I appreciate this topic that you raise about the biopolitical, and think maybe deafness is one way into that. So thank you.
Okay.
We have another question from the chat from Charles Neymog. It's in Portuguese, so I will translate. I would like you to comment on the acoustic space that is created through software, that is, decided in a way by large companies that develop software. For example, the Zabumba and the Spanish guitar can inhabit the same place, can live the same place. How do you see this special expropriation on software? How can we deal with this form of perspective, etc.?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your question. Yeah, this is very interesting. It's I can say it's not something I've focused on yet in my research, in my work. I have some other colleagues who are very much thinking about software, but also more broadly about digital tools. For instance, that digital tools within that are very much present within musical, sonic, architectural practices. So thinking very much how those tools, of course, how are they very much shaping our cultural outputs, our cultural practices. So I think this is really a very strong, really important question. And I would like the opportunity to get more into that, to think and explore that further. Many years ago, I did have the chance to visit the engineering firm Arup, very, very strong global firm. One of their labs in London at that time, about 10 years ago, they were establishing an acoustic lab with some latest technology at that time that they were quite proud of and quite enthusiastic about, because it was an acoustic lab that basically allowed urban planners, architects to hear a space before it's built. So often acoustics, is often responding to a given environment, a given architecture, a given problem. Often acousticians are called in when there's a problem, and they're asked to intervene, to adjust the architecture. So this moment of being able to hear a space before it's built was really important, was revolutionary. And I haven't completely followed up on how that technology has developed.
Okay. Brandon, can you hear us? I think we're having some issues with connection, right?
Yes.
Alguns problemas de conexão, pessoal. Um pouquinho de paciência, a gente acha que já volta. Bom, enquanto vou falar em português, que eu estou vendo que boa parte do público é brasileiro. Enquanto o professor LaBelle não retorna, é só passar uns recados. Hoje a gente, acho que todo mundo está acompanhando que deu um problema geral aí de internet, com Facebook, com tudo, né? Então, só para justificar que a gente trocou de sala, né? Porque uma das ferramentas, aliás, descobrimos, né, que uma das ferramentas que a gente ia usar, que é o StreamYard, é do Facebook, né? Então também caiu essa conexão. Mas se vocês sempre acessarem o nosso site, lá a gente vai ter todos os links atualizados, tá? Tudo, se alguma coisa der um problema e provavelmente a gente trocar de sala, a gente atualiza os PDFs da programação lá, tá? Então fiquem sempre atentos. Aproveito também para falar que agora às 3h30 vai ter o primeiro concerto, né, do Meio Doido. E vamos ver se dá tempo do professor LaBelle voltar para terminar as perguntas, tá? Então vamos aguardar um pouquinho. Quick message in English now. It seems that Professor LaBelle connection is lost. We're gonna wait a little bit and see if there's enough time to finish all the questions. I'm seeing there's a few questions from people from abroad, so we can also send him the questions and perhaps he can answer through email. But in case there's any problem with connection, always go to our website and check the schedule. The PDF schedule is always the best solution to find the latest news about changing a room, changing a YouTube link, okay?
Parece que nós estamos realmente com um problema. Eu tentei contato por mensagem e não consegui resposta.
Alguma coisa com o planeta hoje, né? Foi alguma ação contra a música nova, talvez, quem sabe. Maybe Mark Zuckerberg doesn't like new music. That's why we're having so much internet problem today. I'm seeing a lot of people switching to Telegram now that WhatsApp is dead. And yeah, I think it's gone for good. Okay, so perhaps we can finish, and then we can forward all the other questions to Professor LaBelle, and we can. I think we know everyone who made questions, so we can, if we get an answer, we can let you know, ok? Pessoal, acho que a gente vai então encerrar, né? Tá dando problema de conexão. A gente vai anotar as perguntas e encaminhar para o professor Breno LaBelle. E se a gente tiver um retorno em relação às perguntas, a gente envia para todos, tá bom? Agradecer a presença de vocês, especialmente a generosidade do professor Breno LaBelle em inaugurar o SIM 2021 com essa bela palestra. E convido vocês agora às 15h30 para o primeiro concerto, o concerto do meio doido. Tá? So people, now we move on to the next activity, the first concert of SIM 2021, concert with meio doido duo. It's translated as half crazy duo, something like that. Okay? So I'll see you all. Thank you.